Lonely rancher found a half-blood girl about to be hanged. He drew first. The noose had already kissed the nape of her neck when the drunk-looking cowboy wandered into Fort Despair. Alara Vance stood on the gallows platform, her hands bound tightly behind her back, the desert sun baking the back of her neck, and the wind lifting strands of sweat-matted hair off her face. Dust clung to her skin, her cheeks raw from sand and tears. But her eyes were clear-sharp, with the kind of defiance only the wrongly accused carry to the edge of death. The rope scratched her skin like a living thing, eager to claim her before the truth could breathe. Down below, a crowd of roughly 40 people had gathered in the scorched square. Blacksmiths, ranch hands, wives with bonnets pulled low, and children pressing their noses to store windows, all drawn by the rare thrill of a hanging. Fort Despair hadn't seen one in nearly 4 years, but Judge Silas Gideon meant to make this one memorable. She was 25, a skilled mapmaker working for the Territorial Geological Survey, and within minutes, she would be dead framed for stealing a sacred Apache land chart from the judge's own vault, a theft she didn't commit, a truth she couldn't prove. Gideon's voice boomed across the sun-bleached buildings, his white beard swaying with each enunciation like some prophet from a false scripture. Alara Vance, you stand convicted of treason and theft against this community, against the peace we hold with the Apache tribes, and against the law of man and God. Her knees trembled, but not from fear, from fury. She had been working in Gideon's study the night the map vanished, correcting border coordinates, when she saw Evelyn Gideon, his delicate, always nervous wife, carry something wrapped in silk out the back door. She watched from the shadows as Evelyn buried it near the old pecan tree. She knew then. The map hadn't been stolen by outsiders. It had been hidden, planted. A setup. If you love cowboy love stories, frontier justice, and Wild West redemption tales, drop a ton of #1 second in the comments. Let's ride this trail together, only on Wild West Love. Gaudio e.g. But who would believe the word of a quiet surveyor woman over that of the town's God-fearing judge? The crowd murmured, a mixture of morbid excitement and something deeper doubt. Not all eyes watched with glee. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others simply stared, searching for the justice they were promised, but couldn't quite see. Garrett Shaw, the executioner long-limbed and twitchy as a buzzard in church, tested the trapdoor's hinge with one boot. It groaned under her. Alara's heart thundered so loudly she could feel it climbing her throat, battling the rope for space. She closed her eyes and tried to speak a prayer. Nothing came, only dust and silence. She had never betrayed anyone, never sold a lie. She had worked through heat and rain, charting land so others could settle safely, so towns could be mapped without blood. She'd walked miles with blistered feet, slept with her compass clutched to her chest like a crucifix. She did it for integrity, for truth, and now she was about to die for uncovering too much of it. Judge Gideon pulled out his pocket watch, polished silver catching the sun like a mirror to damnation. His cold gray eyes found hers for a heartbeat, and in them she saw satisfaction. He was enjoying this. The judge snapped the watch shut and gave Garrett the nod. Garrett reached for the lever, and that's when the gallows whispered again, not from the wind, but from spurs. Clink, clink, clink. Slow, deliberate, a rhythm born not of fear, but of purpose. Heads turned. A stir rippled through the crowd like dry grass catching flame. A figure approached from the edge of the square, dusty, swaying slightly, like a man who'd spent too many nights with a bottle and too many mornings regretting it. His coat hung long and frayed, the color of old coffee. His hat was bent at one side, shadowing a face lean with sun and road. He moved like someone halfway between a hangover and a memory. But each step up the wooden platform echoed like thunder in the stillness. Silas Gideon narrowed his eyes. This is a solemn proceeding. Step down or be arrested. The stranger blinked slowly, as if the words took too long to reach him. This what y'all call justice, he slurred, hanging a woman for something she didn't do? A titter of murmurs broke from the crowd. Captain Benedict, standing to the side with a furrowed brow, took a cautious step forward. His hand moved, almost instinctively, to the revolver at his side. "You're interrupting the law, mister," the captain warned. Back away. Lower. The cowboy wobbled slightly, then steadied himself. I got no quarrel with the law, just with liars wearing robes. He reached slowly into the inside of his coat. The hangman flinched. Benedict gripped his revolver's handle, but what the stranger pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a badge. Old, worn, tarnished nearly beyond reading but still there. Federal Private Marshal. Territory appointed. A gasp rolled through the crowd. Even Gideon took half a step back. The man raised the badge just high enough to catch the light, then tucked it away again. Name's Clay Callahan, and I ain't here to watch a woman die for speaking the truth. He turned to Alara, eyes scanning her face not with pity but with something sharper. Recognition. Connection. Then he looked to the crowd. This woman is being hanged, not because she stole a map, but because she saw one. Silas Gideon's voice cracked like a whip. Lies. But his hand moved slightly toward his coat, and Alara, for the first time in days, felt something like air returning to her lung. Hope, or something close. Clay shifted his stance, boot firm against the trapdoor. I've got what you buried, Judge, he said, voice suddenly stone sober. And the truth's about to hang a whole lot heavier than this rope. The days that followed the hanging trial were long and windless. Heat shimmered above the plains like ghosts refusing to settle, and dust clung to everything: the windows of the general store, the boots lined outside the bunkhouse, even to Alara's breath when she tried to sleep. But Clay McKenna didn't leave town. He didn't say why. He just stayed. Each morning, Alara would catch him fixing something out near the blacksmith's barn, tying down a loose rail, talking to the horses like they understood grief. He barely spoke to her, but every time she looked up from behind the bar, his eyes were already there, steady, storm-dark, like he was guarding something he hadn't been asked to guard. And strangely, Alara didn't flinch from that anymore. She remembered the night after the trial. She hadn't planned on staying late at the saloon, but the lanterns had gone soft, and the music had stopped, and there was nowhere else to be. Clay had walked her home. They didn't speak, except for one thing. You should get out of here, he'd said. She stopped under the porch light, squinting at him through the heat and shame. And go where? He looked down at his boots, then up at the stars. Wherever you want, long as it ain't here. Fort Despair, don't deserve you. And then he tipped his hat like an old memory and walked off into the dark. She'd stood there for a long time that night, listening to cicadas, wondering why a man like Clay, who'd once stolen horses for a living, was now looking at her like she mattered more than the law ever had. The next day, he came into the saloon early, before the poker hand started, before the music. Just her, polishing the counter, wiping away a smudge that wouldn't leave. You got sugar? He asked. She blinked, taken off guard. Sugar? For coffee. She poured a spoonful into his tin cup. He sipped, grimaced, then nodded. You make it bitter, he said. Well, she smirked, maybe you bring out the worst in people. He chuckled, a low, broken sound that cracked something inside her, something soft that had been held in too long. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Why are you really here, Clay? He stared into his cup like it held the answer. Then he looked at her, not at her body, not at her scars, just at her. Because I've been running my whole life. And that night on the gallows, when I saw you stand still in front of death like you weren't afraid to meet it, I realized I didn't want to run anymore. Loaf. Alara's throat tightened. She looked down at her hands. Burn marks still showed faint against her wrists, the kind that never fade. She had once thought no man would ever look past them, but Clay wasn't looking past them. He was looking at them, and not turning away. That night, it rained. Real rain, the kind that bled into wood and smelled like forgiveness. The saloon roof leaked in 5 places, but no one cared. They just moved the chairs, kept drinking, kept laughing. Alara stood out back under the eaves, letting the droplets hit her bare shoulders. Her dress clung wet against her ribs, and for the first time in a year, she didn't care how she looked. She was alive. Clay joined her in the doorway, his hat tilted back, his shirt half open at the collar, damp from the ride in. You always stand in the rain like this? He asked. Only when I want to remember who I was before the fire. He was quiet for a moment, then stepped forward just enough so his arm brushed hers. You ever gonna tell me what happened? She swallowed. Rain traced down her spine. One day, his hand didn't touch her, but it hovered close. Close enough she could feel its heat, its restraint. She turned to him, slowly. What about you? You ever gonna stop running? Clay looked out across the street, where the rain hit the old church bell in slow, silver beats. I might have already stopped, he said. Just don't know if I can stay. Ilara smiled, the kind that hurt in the corners. Then don't promise me nothing you can't keep. He nodded, but didn't move. They stood there, side by side, like two broken fence posts, leaning on each other just enough to not fall down. The days blurred. Clay started sleeping out by the stables, fixing saddles, mending wheels, helping with freight wagons like he'd lived there all his life. And Ilara, she laughed more. The townsfolk noticed. Might be you tamed that outlaw, old Mrs. Jenkins said one afternoon, watching them from her porch. Or maybe he's the one fixin' to tame you. Ilara laughed and waved it off. But that night, as she watched Clay hammer down a broken latch under moonlight, sweat beading his temple, shirt tugged tight over shoulders hardened from the road, she wondered. What if she wasn't broken? What if she'd just never met someone strong enough to stand with her when the world turned cruel? Clay didn't ask for her secrets. He just stayed close. And when he looked at her, there was no shame, no desire to fix, only witness, only presence. That was the most dangerous kind of love, she realized. The kind that makes you want to stay when you've spent your whole life surviving by leaving. One night, just before closing, he caught her humming a hymn, the kind her mama used to sing before the war took everything. He leaned on the doorway. Sing that again. She stopped, flushed. You heard that? He nodded. It was beautiful. Sounded like home. She turned away, biting her lip. I ain't had a home in a long time, Clay. He stepped inside, quiet as dusk, and said the one thing that undid her. Maybe we can build one. Her knees nearly buckled, because in that moment, she realized Clay McKenna was no longer a stranger. He was a roof in a storm. And her heart, long buried beneath ash and grit and loneliness, began to beat again, slowly, wildly, like a runaway horse that had finally found its way back to the gate. The dawn that followed the storm brought an eerie calm to Fort Despair. The streets, still damp from last night's rain, reflected the pale gold light of sunrise, and the broken air smelled of fresh mud and new beginnings. Ilara awoke on her cot in the makeshift office she'd set up in the old survey station, a simple cot, a rough-hewn desk, and maps pinned crookedly to the walls. She blinked, remembering the closeness of Clay's voice in the doorway, urging her with hope she hadn't dared to hold. Now, morning light filled that same doorway, and with it, Clay McKenna stepped in. He was careful, as though not wanting to disturb the fragile hope they'd built together. Water dripped from his coat sleeves, and the faint scent of leather and rain clung to him. He held out a folded square of cloth, the silver scarf from around his neck the night he appeared. I don't need this yet, he said, his voice a quiet rumble, but I'll wear it again when I'm ready. Ilara took it. The fabric felt cool between her calloused fingers, threaded with stories she didn't yet understand. She looked up at him, and in his steady, unresolved gaze, she saw all the things they had yet to uncover. Later that day, they found themselves standing at the edge of the abandoned cedar mine, where Clay had first discovered the charred map that ignited this fight. The entrance was dark, the rock stained with old blood and dust. Clay pulled a battered lantern from his saddlebag, its glass cracked but intact. Inside, a small flame flickered to life, the light trembling like hope in this forgotten place. Put your ear down, he said. Hear that? At first, Ilara heard only the wind whistling through unseen crevices, like a train past distant hills. But then, beyond the rustle of rocks, came another sound, faint, rhythmic, like a hinge creaking or a heartbeat. They crouched low together at the mouth of the shaft. That's it, he breathed. That's where he buried it. They crawled in, ducking beneath beams rotted by time. The air was thick, choked with the smell of mold and despair. Ilara's fingers traced the cool metal of her survey compass, guiding her steps. Once, she'd believed maps were static lines etched on parchment, unchanging. Now she realized they were stories, shifting, living things. They came to a patch of disturbed earth beneath a fallen beam. Clay kelped slowly, brushing away loose rock. "What is it?" Alara whispered. He pulled a small, roughly hewn wooden box from the dirt. It was blackened and cracked, a relic of desperation. He opened it with trembling hands, and inside lay family photographs, yellowed letters, a silver chain, and a small leather pouch embroidered with the name Eliza McKenna. Clay's breath hitched. Alara reached out and touched the pouch. "It's your sister's," she said. "The one you couldn't remember." "Lie." He knelt there, trembling. "I thought I lost everything when he shot me," he whispered. "But it's here. She's here." Alara knelt beside him. He reached up and brushed rain-damp strands of sand-blonde hair off her forehead. "I remember now," he said, voice raw. "I remember the night they came. I was hidden in the barn. I heard her scream, and then nothing." Red. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks, and for the first time, Alara saw the broken foundation beneath the outlaw's exterior. She saw a boy who'd survived with a heart half shattered but still beating with loyalty. "I remember him," Clay said, voice tightening as he looked up. "Silas Gideon. He paid the ranch hands to kill them. And he shot me, left me bleeding. I crawled here, into this mine, where I had a name tag from my horse. I packed what I could, and I dragged myself away, but I forgot who I was." He took the pouch, Eliza's pouch, and pressed it to his chin. "He paid people to lie, to burn my ranch, to cover his thefts. And I forgot who I was until you made me remember." Alara reached out, smiles trembling on her rose-stained lips. She took his hand and squeezed it. "You remembered. You didn't let him win." Lund. They sat there, banded by shared loss and renewed purpose, as lantern light fought shadow and rain dripped through broken wood. The map, the pouch, the photographs, they were puzzle pieces finally aligning. Back in the town square, the gallows still stood a silent relic of fear. But today, it would serve as a stage for justice, not death. Captain Benedict arrived, sober and resolute, flanked by 3 deputies from the territorial capital. They wore stern, careful expressions, men unused to miracles, but now witnesses to one unfolding. Silas Gideon stood at the foot of the gallows, coat torn and face pale, rage quivering just below his thin veneer of control. Evelyn Gideon hovered behind him, clutching letters, her knuckles white. Clay stepped onto the platform, beside Alara. He placed the silver pouch and charred map on the rail. In his parka-lined eyes, there was something both fierce and vulnerable, like steel warmed by embers. "Judge Gideon," he began, voice carrying over the plain. "You taught Fort Despair that standing on this platform meant guilt. But truth ain't measured by rope or robes, it's measured by scars and evidence. And I got both." He held up the charred map. Alara Vance drew the land. She laid down lines no man should cross. You stole those lines. You rewrote them. You buried the truth. Yucca won. Evelyn stepped forward, letters in hand. "These are the letters he wrote me," she said, voice torn. Letters where he confessed to taking funds from federal land grants to buy off officials, to pay off those who'd kill my brother's family. To me, because I saw him write it, he told me he was ashamed. I kept these to remind him, and then he burned the originals when he killed the ranch. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Even the wind stopped. Judge Gideon's hands shook. "Those lies, they're lies." Captain Benedict cleared his throat. "Your Honor, you have one chance. Leave Fort Despair. Go to trial in Tucson under federal authority. Because right here, under that badge, truth matters more than your reputation." Silas's gaze flickered to Clay's badge, then to Alara's face, defiant, resolute, alive. "Never," he whispered. But his voice broke, and then he did something unexpected. He dropped into a broken bow, head bowed, shoulders shuddering. Evelyn slipped beside him and laid her hand on his trembling back. The crowd murmured, some in shock, some in relief. They'd seen a man self-destruct under the weight of his own lies. Later, that afternoon, the judge and his wife were escorted to a federal carriage. They left with no grand procession, only quiet tears and the smell of freshly raked dust. Ilara and Clay remained on the gallows platform long after. The sky overhead had turned the palest blue, and the sun was sliding toward dusk. She held out a long ribbon, her own survey flag, red and gold. He took it gently. "Maps change," she said. "Boundaries disappear. But this," she let the ribbon drop, letting it drift between them. Clay unbuckled his badge and laid it beside it. "No more badges," he said. "Not yet." She nodded. "When you're ready." They stood together, two souls stitched together in survival, maps, and memory. The gallows remained a symbol no longer of fear, but of reclaimed strength, and for the first time in centuries, Fort Despair felt like home. The desert was a different kind of quiet at night, nocturnal, pulsing, breathing with life unseen. Under a sky full of prairie stars that blinked like God's own lanterns, Caleb Mackenzie stood by the dying fire, boots planted firm into the cracked red earth, eyes flickering between the flames and the silhouette of the woman sleeping not 10 feet away. June Callahan had finally drifted off, after hours of stubborn silence that Caleb respected more than he let on. She hadn't spoken much after they'd left Bitter Creek, only enough to ask for water and, once, to say thank you. But the way her shoulders curled in when the wind picked up, the way her fingers clutched the old cavalry coat he'd thrown over her like a shield, those gestures said more than words ever could. She was carrying the weight of what had almost happened back in town, and maybe the weight of her whole life before that too. He sat down on a flat rock and lit a cigarette with a match that hissed against the desert wind. The smoke curled in slow spirals, and his thoughts drifted back to the hanging, how close she'd come to the end. One wrong step, one less minute, and June would have been buried in the dirt beside the gallows like so many before her. Caleb had seen death, caused death, lived beside it so long it had become more companion than enemy. But her death, number. He couldn't unsee that rope against her neck, couldn't forget the way her lips trembled when she looked at him like maybe, just maybe, he'd come to save her. The fire popped, and she stirred. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. Her eyes opened wide, dark, cautious like a doe on the edge of a trap. "You talk a lot for someone who rides alone," she whispered, voice hoarse from dust and silence. Caleb smiled, a slow, tired thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Guess I forgot how to be alone since you started snoring." "That's..." She snorted, surprising them both. "I don't snore. You sound like a raccoon fighting a possum in a whiskey barrel." June sat up slowly, brushing hair from her face, and in the firelight Caleb could see the streaks of dried tears still clinging to her skin like the last traces of a storm. Her voice was quiet when she asked, "Why'd you do it?" "Do what?" "Stop the hanging. Risk your neck for a girl you don't even know." "Lunt." Caleb took a long drag, the ember lighting his features in brief flickers. "Because I knew you were innocent." "How?" "I didn't," he admitted. "But I knew Blackwood was a liar. And I know the look in a person's eyes when they're about to die for something they didn't do. I've worn that look myself." She stared at him then, long and hard, like she was trying to peel him open with nothing but her gaze. "You don't strike me as the savin' kind." "I ain't." "Then. So why?" He let the silence stretch between them like a bridge half built. Then he said, "Because something in me broke when I saw you up there, and I think maybe, just maybe, it's something worth fixin'." The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass and sending a coyote's howl dancing across the horizon. June pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders, then stood and walked toward him. Her boots made soft crunches in the dirt. She didn't say a word, just sat beside him, close enough for their shoulders to touch. They stared at the fire together for a while. "My mama used to say," June murmured, "that life would test you in ways that make death seem easy. I never understood what she meant, until I stood on that platform." Caleb looked at her, eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I was ready to die," she said, voice cracking. "Not because I wanted to, but because I thought there wasn't anything left worth fighting for. And then I saw you." She paused, eyes wet again. "And I hated you for interrupting it." Caleb blinked. "You what now?" "I hated you. For giving me back something I didn't know how to hold anymore." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And now?" June didn't answer right away. Her hand reached out tentative, trembling, and brushed his arm, just once. Then she pulled back, folded it into her lap. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I want to learn." The next days were quiet, but not in the way loneliness is. The road eastward stretched like a ribbon through the hills, and they took it slow, June still healing from the bruises on her neck and wrists. Caleb watching her like a hawk that had somehow found reason to care. She asked questions sometimes about his scars, his past, the meaning behind the tattoo on his forearm that said, Fort Douglas, 1872, and Caleb, for the first time in years, answered. He told her about the war, about losing his brother at Shiloh and never feeling anything since, about riding with bounty hunters who shot more men than they caught, about waking up drunk in the dirt outside Amarillo one morning and realizing he didn't want to die just yet. June listened. She never interrupted, never tried to fix him. She just sat there, brown eyes wide, lips pressed together like she was tasting every word on her tongue before swallowing it whole. One night, 2 weeks out from Bitter Creek, they camped in the ruins of an old mining shack outside Dry Hollow. The wind howled through broken windows, and June wrapped herself in the cavalry coat like it was armor. "You ever think about settling down?" she asked him suddenly. Caleb poked at the fire. "What would that even look like for a man like me? A porch, a dog, maybe some chickens, a woman who don't flinch when you raise your voice." He laughed. "You?" She looked away. "Maybe." He reached out, hand gentle against her shoulder. "I think about it more than I'd like to admit." June turned her face toward him, and in the orange flicker of firelight, something passed between them, an invitation, quiet and raw and unspoken. Caleb's thumb brushed her cheek. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No," she said, "but for the first time in a long time I want to be sure of something." Their kiss wasn't the kind poets write about. It was clumsy and soft and real. Her lips tasted like dust and hope. His hands were rough against her jaw, but careful, like he was holding something breakable. They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to. The scaffold burned for 3 nights. No one dared extinguish it. The townsfolk of Fort Despair, once shackled by fear and silence, stood in a growing circle around the flames. It was more than wood that turned to ash. It was judgment without justice, a symbol of every man and woman who had been wrongly condemned under Gideon's twisted reign. Sparks floated like tiny ghosts into the desert sky, whispering names that had been lost in courtrooms where truth was gagged and innocence priced. Clay stood near the blaze, his hand resting loosely over the silver locket hanging from his neck, his sister's, worn smooth by his fingers. The fire reflected in his eyes, flickering in time with the tight rhythm of his breath. For the first time in years, his gaze was clear. No fog of trauma, no haze of half-formed memories, just presence, just grief, and finally, peace. Ilara stood beside him, silent, her arms crossed over her chest as if shielding the vulnerable center that had reopened in her. The firelight painted her face in gold and scarlet, as though the very desert had come alive upon her skin. In the weeks since Gideon's fall, she had barely slept, not out of fear, but purpose. She had redrawn every map in Gideon's private office, corrected every boundary he'd falsified, marked in crimson ink the trails of the families he had displaced, the lands he had stolen from the native tribes, the graves that had been forgotten under false settlements. She had gone from cartographer to historian to witness. Her pen, once used to trace the gentle curves of rivers and peaks, now drew the spine of a new justice. And Fort Despair, long bent under the weight of shadow, began to stand. In the courthouse that once echoed with Gideon's cold verdicts, Captain Benedict now wore the badge of sheriff not as a symbol of authority, but of accountability. He was not proud of how long he had looked the other way, but the truth had a way of seeping into the soul like desert wind, unyielding, eroding all pretense. The first order he gave was simple. "Tear it down," he had said, pointing to the scaffold. "Then burn it. We will not hang justice anymore." And so they did. But that wasn't the only change. The jail cells beneath the building were unlocked, cleaned, and turned into shelters for families who had nowhere left to go. The court, once a place of sentences, became a place of stories where the wrongly accused spoke their truths aloud, and children drew pictures of stars and horses on the once bleak walls. Clay took to riding again. Not far, just enough. Every morning, he'd saddle the old chestnut mare the townspeople gifted him, ride to the edge of the mesa, and watch the sunrise bleed across the canyon. He never said much about what he saw, but his eyes always came back different, lighter, a little less haunted. Ilara watched him from her porch one morning, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. The wind pulled her hair loose, dancing around her face like threads of smoke. "You're starting to look like someone who belongs," she said when he returned. Clay glanced at her, then up toward the sky, where hawks wheeled overhead. "I think I do," he replied, voice low, steady. "At least I'd like to." Their bond never became romantic. And yet, it was deeper than love. It was two souls, each fractured by different storms, who found in each other a mirror that didn't judge, didn't flinch. Clay never asked Ilara why she had chosen to stay. Ilara never asked Clay to explain the nightmares that sometimes pulled him awake in the middle of the night. They didn't need to. Some things were understood in silence, in the way he brought her a flower he didn't know the name of, or how she left a lantern lit by her window so he'd know she was safe. The silver locket, the last piece of Clay's sister, became a quiet tether between them. Ilara never asked to hold it. One day, Clay simply placed it on the table between them as they reviewed the final map of restored lands. "She would have liked you," he murmured. Ilara's hand hovered above it, then withdrew. "She would have been proud of you." There were others who returned. The families whose lands were stolen by Gideon's fraud came back tired, cautious, but hopeful. The native elders whose burial grounds had been paved over came with prayers, cleansing the soil with smoke and song. Clay stood beside them in silence, hat in hand. He said nothing, just listened. The children of the town no longer played behind boarded windows. They raced through the dust with laughter, daring each other to jump from low rocks and telling tales of the outlaw with no name, who saved the town. Clay, who still refused to give them his full story. They didn't need it. To them, he was already legend. One night, during the final fire ceremony, Ilara stood before the town with her maps spread out behind her, pinned between timber and sky. "This is not just about land," she told them. "This is about truth. Every inch that was stolen was a story erased. We can't bring the dead back, but we can remember them, and we can make sure this never happens again." Clay stood in the back of the crowd, arms crossed. He didn't smile, but something in his face relaxed like a thread that had finally gone slack. The townspeople voted to rename the square, not after Gideon, but after Mira, Clay's sister. "Ilara found her name in the trial records," Benedict explained. "We thought it was time someone else got remembered." The locket now sat in a frame inside the new community hall, beneath a plaque. "To those silenced, may your voices now carry on the wind." 1 year later, the town looked different, not because it had grown, but because it had healed. The church no longer tolled for executions, but for weddings and the birth of new children. The saloon had a library corner, thanks to Ilara's insistence. The old jail had a vegetable garden behind it, where Clay sometimes worked quietly, sleeves rolled, hands deep in the earth. And at the edge of town, near the first wellspring, stood a new sign, Fort Despair, now a place of hope. As the last embers of the gallows turned to ash, Fort Despair exhaled not loudly, not triumphantly, but with the quiet relief of a town that had held its breath for far too long. Ilara stood beside Clay on the hillside, overlooking the main street. The townsfolk had dispersed, leaving only scattered lanterns flickering like fireflies in the night. The noose was gone, but its shadow lingered in the smoke that curled upward, dissolving into stars. Clay didn't speak. His hand rested on the hilt of his revolver not as a weapon, but as a memory. The metal was cold, heavy, and familiar, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to use it. Justice had been served, not by the barrel of a gun, but by truth, courage, and choices made when no one was looking. "I don't think we won," Ilara said, her voice soft, almost uncertain. Clay turned slightly. "No, we didn't win, Clay. We survived. And surviving means we carry all of it, the fear, the grief, the anger. It doesn't go away. It just changes shape." He looked out toward the burned ruins of the courthouse. Maybe that's enough. No, she said quietly. It's not. But it's where we begin. Maine. Over the following weeks, Fort Despair changed not all at once, and not without resistance. Pain does not simply vanish when its source is removed. It lingers, echoing in habits and stares, in silences during town meetings, in empty chairs at dinner tables. But little by little, the town began to breathe again. Ilara moved into the old surveyor's cabin near the edge of town. She refurbished it with her own hands, repairing cracked walls, sanding down warped beams, opening windows long nailed shut. She painted the inside with warm earth tones and pinned her maps along the walls, each one more detailed than the last. But these were not maps of conquest or control. They were stories of stolen land returned, of creeks rediscovered and renamed by their original tribal names, of homes restored to families who had once been chased into the hills. People began coming to her, not with gold or guns, but with questions. Where did my grandfather say our fence line was? Or, can you show me where the springs used to be? And Ilara, with her calloused hands and soft, focused eyes, would nod and pull out a sheet of parchment. Clay, meanwhile, rarely stepped into the spotlight. He lived quietly in the stables behind the sheriff's office, helping with livestock, repairing wagons, sometimes offering to escort children home after school. He didn't speak much, but the kids adored him. They whispered stories that he was a cowboy ghost who had returned to protect the town. Clay never corrected them. He and Ilara rarely spoke of what they had been through. Their bond was forged not in declarations but in presence, two people who had stood on the brink and chose not to fall. One late afternoon, as golden light filtered through the cottonwoods, Ilara sat on her porch with a steaming mug of coffee. She watched Clay approaching, his steps deliberate, a paper folded in his hand. He sat beside her without invitation. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's dangerous," she teased, but her smile faded as she saw the look in his eyes. "I want to leave something behind. Not a legend. Not some twisted tale about the man who returned from the dead. Just the truth." He handed her the paper. It was a handwritten letter, no address, no recipient, just a confession. His story, the real one. "You sure you want this in the town records?" she asked, carefully folding the pages again. "I want someone to know," he said, "and I trust you." Ilara didn't reply. She simply tucked the letter into a leather journal beside her. Clay understood that was her way of saying yes. Seasons changed. Wildflowers bloomed in places once trampled by cavalry boots. Children played in front of the chapel where the gallows had once cast its grim shadow. Captain Benedict, now Sheriff Benedict, planted a tree in that very spot. A strong young oak that grew taller every year. He tended to it personally, watering it every morning. One winter morning, snow fell gently across Fort Despair. It was the kind of snow that muted sound and made even old scars look soft. Ilara stood outside her cabin, her breath rising in silver clouds, and found Clay already there, standing by the oak, gazing up into its bare branches. "I had a dream last night," he said when she reached him. "Was it a good one?" "I think so." He paused. "I saw a girl on a hill. She was laughing, holding a kite made of maps." Ilara closed her eyes. "Sounds like someone you loved." "Sounds like someone I let go." They stood in silence. The wind rustled the branches above, and for a moment it sounded like the whisper of wings, as if something had finally taken flight. Years later, travelers passing through Fort Despair would hear of the cartographer who mapped justice and the silent man with the gun who never drew it. They'd see the oak standing tall in the center of town, and if they asked, someone would tell them that tree grows from ashes. And if they looked close enough, just beneath the bark, they might see two sets of initials carved faintly into the wood, not as lovers' markings, but as witnesses. Proof that two souls, lost and fractured, had once stood in the heart of the desert and chose to rebuild, not run. Because Fort Despair was no longer a place of endings. It had become a place where healing began.